Hi everyone, this is Veronica with Sew It Seams, and welcome back to my studio. Today I am going to be starting a pretty big project that I'm hoping will go smoothly and I'll be able to finish in a relatively quick time. So today I am going to begin the first steps of the Chess Vortex quilt. I'll pop up a picture of one that someone else made. They were gracious enough to put the tutorial of how to make this quilt on a blog. So I've gone through. It's a little confusing with some of the cutting that needs to happen just because there's so much going on with this quilt. This quilt is not one that can be strip pieced, because of the way the wedges are to create that circle look, and with each section, those are all different size pieces. So this one, they recommended getting a book or something where you can put each strip in layers in order in a book. I'll see how it goes, but I've written out my cutting instructions here so that way I could visually see what they were meaning with the different things. The person that made this quilt has a blog and it's called Quilt Rascal, and I'll see if I can get a link down so that you, if you're interested in looking at how to make one for yourself, you can make one. So there are, and my first step is cutting 21 different strips. The first 9 strips, it's just one of each color, so I'm doing black and white. The next, let's see, 10 through 17, so that's 8 strips. I'm doing 2 full strips of each color from each of those sizes, and then 1 half strip of each color from each of those sizes. And then the last 4 strips is going to have 3 full strips of each color and 1 half strip of each color. So there's going to be a lot of cutting going on. I don't know how much I'll actually show you of me actually doing things, just because it's a little awkward. I don't have the best tripod set up, but I'll try to show you little glimpses here and there of the process as we're going, and hopefully it won't take too long to finish and I can get it done in time. I currently have 1, 2, 3, looks like 4 weeks. Yes, I have 4 weeks to make this quilt and get it finished. Of course, at the same time that I'm making this quilt, I am making 3 others for a customer. So it's going to be a lot of kind of tedious work with just all the cutting and things like that, but I'm excited to get this thing started, and we'll see how it goes. I have gone through and I cut all my strips for this Chess Vortex quilt, and as I was looking at the next instructions, I was starting to get very confused on having enough strips to sew together and making like I should. My next step is to then sew the strips together, but I was starting to get very confused because I had rows 1 through 9. Well, I have all the strips cut, but rows 1 through 9, I only needed to cut 1 strip of each color. And then the instructions were for rows 1 through 9, have 1 set starting with white and ending with white, and 1 set starting with black and ending with black. And my brain was getting very confused because I kept thinking, but I've only cut 1 strip. I've cut 1 strip of each color. So that means I would sew row 1 of white next to row 2 of black, then row 3 of white, row 4 of black, back and forth. That's easy enough, but my brain is getting just enough confused that as I get going, I am sure I'm going to confuse which row I'm grabbing. One tip that the maker of this quilt, or the designer, whatever, had suggested was taking all your strips and putting them into a book to separate them all, because they're very close in sizes. With a lot of these strips, they're only differences by 1/8 of an inch. So it can get very confusing, so having them in order is a good idea. But what I am pretty sure will happen is if I just leave them that way, because I have these in order, and then behind me I have my black ones laid out, I can almost guarantee that I will end up grabbing strips and sewing a 3 strip of white next to a 3 strip of black, and so that is going to throw things way off. So what I'm doing right now is I am actually taking each of the strips and I'm putting a number on them in order. I'm going to do this with the first 9 and then try to sew these together, and I'm going to put the corresponding white and black of that number together so that I can see my progress of what I'm doing, so I know which one to take. I'm going to try to sew both of them at the same time, both sets. So the set that starts with white and the set that starts with black, I'm going to sew at the same time so that it will be more like a chain piecing almost. So sewing, it's underneath here, but sewing strip 1 to 2 of black, and then right behind it grabbing strip 1 of black and 2 of white. So I think that should keep me in order. And I'm going to take them out of the book because that's just, I understand why she had me do that. But since I'm just going to have my long arm here. Here you can see back here, I've got my black strips on there. I'm just going to lay them out a little bit better and have the black and white together. And I think that will work really well. I hope it does. But I'm going to go slow. I'm going to try not to speed through it. I know I want to get it done, but it's important to get the right strips next to each other because I don't want to unpick things. All right, I'm going to start laying these out and then I'll get to sewing. Here is the layout I have of my strips. So we can see they're all marked and pinned here. I've got 1, this is the white and the black. So I've got 1 through 9 set up here, and if this is a really good method, I'll do that with the other sections also. now have my first two sections sewn together, the strips 1 through 9 for both the ones with the white ends and the ones with the black ends. I need to give them a good press, and then I'll do the same process with the rest of the strips. I have part 1 done of making this quilt. So what I have are sections of strips. These are one of the half length ones. But then we've got some of the longer ones. These are the full length strips of various sizes. And so we can see here, there are all my strips. So I have all the strips done. So these, it's kind of awkward to show you where they are, just because I have long strips to work with here. But I've got all of those done, and that was part 1 of this 3-part quilt. The next part is making a template, and I've already written down my instructions for the measurements. The template wedge is to start creating the just that circular pattern for the quilt, and the wedge isn't one that I can do with any special ruler. So the gal on the blog gave measurements of how to draw it out and mark it so that I can make the template. So that'll be the next step, getting this template made. And I didn't read ahead enough yet to find out what I'll be cutting, but first let's make a template. I've got my template cut, and pretty faint lines, but I've got marked 1/4 of an inch in, so that makes sure that I don't cut too far in when I'm creating my template, or when I'm cutting the wedges. So here's the template. The next instructions were to fold it in half, and from what I understand, it's matching the straight lines at different points that are going across. I'm just kind of taking it step by step because some of it I'm not fully understanding, but it says to fold it in half, and then when I get down to the last 2 or 3 inches, not worrying about it lining up. And then it looks like the last 2 or 3 inches are actually trimmed away on this. So I will start folding this and seeing if we get this template exactly how they want it. These are now the strips all sewn together into their sections. We have this section here of strips 1 through 9, both the black dominant and the white dominant strips. Then here there's 1 of each of those. Then I have 2 each of these strip sets, which are pieces, so 10 through 17, and 2 of the black dominant, 2 of the white dominant. And then the last 4 have 3 sets of the black dominant and 3 of the white dominant. And all of these are the full length strips. And then with the last four, I have one of each of the half strips. And then this is the pile of half strips that were cut for the middle sections, strips 10 through 17. I haven't come across the instructions yet of what to do with those, but that will probably be involved with sewing strips the sections together. So this is the end of part 1. Now it's time to make the wedge in part 2. Okay, I have my template ready to do the wedge section for sections 1 through 9. So my 1 through 9 fabric for each, the black and the white, are here. And the template was just marked with these lines. It was folded in half so that this center fold would run along the line of my quilt ruler, and then I marked each seam line for the first section of this quilt. These strips are part of the center part of the quilt, so this center starting outward. So the template was lined up here, and then those lines I will line up with each of those seams just like that. It took me a little bit to understand what I'm doing next, but I'm cutting 22 wedges from each fabric right along the edge of the template on either side. 2 of them will have an untrimmed side on the left, and 2 will have an untrimmed side on the right, and about 1/2 inch. Those untrimmed ones will be used in being on the edges to sew in a segment. We're making 4 quadrants of this quilt, and then once each quadrant, the quarter, is made, then those will all be sewn together. So there's going to be a lot of cutting and then trying to piece as precisely as possible. The person that wrote the blog did mention that it might not all be precise. Some of hers was not, but you'd have to have the quilt police coming out with their rulers. And if someone wants to come that close to do that, then I don't want them looking. All right, so I'm going to start working on trimming these wedges and seeing if it all works. Here we go. Here's a little update on the progress of the Chess Vortex so far. These are the strips from sections 1 through 9. They're a bit of a mess because I had to quickly move things over. And I am currently trimming the sections 10 through 17. And here is my next one that is set up to trim. This freezer paper is working really well as a template. It holds really well once it's pressed on there, and I'm able to trim it, and it works just fine. So I have, I believe, 12 or 13 already on here cut. I'm going to be cutting through this section. I need to get 22 total, and then 2 more of the untrimmed sections for this middle section. Here are all the wedge sections cut from the strips 1 through 9. And then here are the strips from the middle section, covering strips 11 through 19, I believe it is. With each of these sections, I had some left over. So here are the pieces from the smaller sections that's left over, not very much. And then this is what I have left over from the middle section. And then we have these strips. Let me talk about these strips. In my instructions for cutting out the strips for this quilt, in the middle section, it wanted me to cut full-length strips, 2 of them for each color, and then 1/2 strip for each color. Then the instructions didn't tell me what to do with them until I got to this part, and it wanted me to then cut some of these middle sections out of the half strips. The thing is when I cut from the full strips, I had plenty of room and I actually have fabric left over. So now I have these single strips that I don't actually need for this quilt as far as I can tell. I won't get rid of them because they might come into play later or I might use them for something else. But for right now, I was able to get all the wedges cut from the 2 full-length strips. Now I'm going to move on to the outer part of the wedges, the third grouping, which are the strips 18 through 21. So I'm going to do the same thing with the freezer paper template, and I'm going to mark the lines on there so I can line them up and cut out the final wedges. I have now finished cutting all the wedges out. There were 156 total wedges to cut, but I have them in groups of 3 sections, and now the next step will be taking each section and sewing them together. So I have to make sure that I am going to be lining up the proper colors. So this one starts white going to black. This is the outer part going toward the center. So the black, and then I will sew the next one together, white going to black, and then sewing the white to the white. So then this will create one long wedge, and I will go through and sew those all together, and then I should have 52 wedges for making this quilt. Yes, if the math is correct, I'll have 22 wedges that will start, well, starting from the center, we'll start with the white going to white, and then I will have 22 wedges starting with the black going to black. And then there are 4 wedges that are untrimmed on either side. And so those are going to be for each of the quadrants, because this quilt is going to be sewn together in 4 sections. So here we go, sewing now all of the wedges into one long wedge. Well, I'm set up to sew my sections together, and I did 1 full wedge just to see how it's sewed together. I wanted to show you something. In each of the sections where they join, there's a difference in the sizes. I've got that join there, and then this join here. I've followed everything exactly how they wanted me to, and I'm not quite sure why there is such a difference. It's within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I think I'm going to leave it because I'm not quite sure where the change needs to happen. And they all look to be the right size. I don't see a difference in the sizes other than just doing the gradual smaller to larger. So I'm just letting you know this was an issue potentially. But when I was looking at the instructions, one thing it was saying when I'm sewing the parts together, the author said, don't worry so much about getting an exact 1/4 inch seam when we're sewing the wedges together, when all of them together. Don't worry so much about getting the exact 1/4 inch seam, worry more about matching the seams. So that's what I'll be doing, and I'm pretty good at fudging things, so we'll see how it goes. I'm just a little perplexed as to why there is that difference. But oh well, I'm gonna keep going. I think it won't make too big of a problem. We'll find out. Here we go. I'm gonna start sewing. Now finished part 2 of creating these wedges. All the wedges are sewn together and they're in their long strips. They're pressed, and I have them separated into the set that starts with the white and the set that starts with the black. Now we're ready to move to part 3. Now with part 3, we are making 4 quadrants, and the first thing that we'll do, we'll work on one quadrant by laying out 13 wedges. The outer wedges, wedge 1 and 13, is going to be the untrimmed ones, and I still have them marked with a pin on which side is untrimmed. So I'm starting with one quadrant that has a black untrimmed, and I went ahead and laid them out. They're on my long arm right now because that's the only space I have, but I have all 13 laid out, and this is the other untrimmed on this side. So now I'm going to start sewing these strips together. Now the important thing is not to get the exact 1/4 inch seam, but to make sure that our points are all lining up. So this is where the test will come on how well I sewed everything together and if it lines up properly. When we get to the ends on these sections down here, this is where it's going to become tricky, just because it's going to become bulky trying to get that exact seam. So they recommend to do just one quadrant at a time to see if it comes together well and is the right size, right shape before moving on to the next one. So here we go. These are my first 2 wedges sewn together, and I'm pressing. It says to press the seam to the same side. So I will be paying attention to where my pin is and pressing so all the seams go into that direction. Well, I have my first group of 13 wedges sewn together, and this is supposed to be the one quadrant of the quilt. As you can see, I don't have a 45-degree angle on this quilt.
if I were to trim this, I could get one side, but this side is not going in the right angle. I need to think about how I'm going to fix that. This is a little, I'm just not sure. I think, as much as I hate to do this, I think I need to come to each of these seams and starting right about here, go in just a little bit more on each seam so that it does bring it in. But I don't know. It's late tonight, so I'm going to have to put this to the side and think on it, and see if I can get that to work better. All right, I've taken some time to think this through, and with my square ruler here on this wedge, I'm looking at how this lays out, and this is my center angle here, right here, and so I have 6 wedges on that side. Then I'm thinking add 2 more wedges, and that should get me the angle that I need, possibly 3. So I think what I'm going to do is just rip this one seam here on this outer edge very carefully, add in 2 wedges, remeasure, and then possibly a 3rd one. But I think that will help solve the issue. All right, there has been a lot of work since the last time I checked in. As you can see, I almost have all the quadrants done. What I needed to do with each of these quadrants was add in extra strips, and it's made it to the size that I need. Now, as you can see with this one, it's not quite big enough combined with this one, but it looks like what I'm going to need is one more strip over here that has the white beginning and end, and then over here I'm thinking a white, black, white, and I think that'll be enough. We'll see what happens when we sew it together, but you can already kind of see how there's that little bit of a spiral pattern happening in the center. So this may not be as precise or as exact as it should be, but it is going to be pretty close. So I'm going to go back. I think I have a few more strips already made, but we will, well, I'll sew what I have and then see where I am from there. My tripod broke, so it was too difficult to get video of the next steps. But I was able to get all of the parts sewn together to make one big circle for this quilt, so you see the entire center there. Since I had already sewn the entire center into one large circle, I didn't have the 4 quadrants like the instructions originally stated I should. So I folded this into 4ths to lay it out on fabric to create the outer border. I folded the white background fabric in half and then laid the arc over it and traced it. Then I trimmed 1/2 inch into the white fabric, so it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance there. And then I found it easiest just to take that white arc that I already cut and lay it over the black fabric, which was also folded in half, and then traced that exact line there and cut the black fabric. I just quickly want to say I am not sure if the way I am making this border is the correct way or not, partly because I've sewn the entire center circle in together instead of keeping them into quadrants. I didn't keep them into quadrants because I was struggling with getting them the right size, and sewing all four the same size just wasn't working properly because of some errors that I made. But I ended up sewing the entire circle together, so had to do some folding and laying out. So it's a little bit different than what the instructions suggested I do. And so I've cut the borders, and I have 2 of the white and 2 of the black. I have no idea if they're going to line up properly with the outer edges, but you know, I'll do the best that I can. So I'm going to try to get these borders on, and then start looking at the templates for the chess pieces. The instructions, or the person that made the Chess Vortex originally doesn't have templates for them, but I should be able to find some and then just enlarge or shrink to get to the right size that looks good for the quilt. So fingers crossed that this goes well. This border part is what makes me a little nervous. I'm trying to keep enough room for adjustment, but I do have a concern that the border will end up being too tight for the outer part. I'm trying to leave plenty of seam allowance so that I have room to move around with that. So here goes. Because I'm having to sew each border on the quadrants individually, I have sewn one section on, and then I've sewn the next one on without connecting them. Part of the reason I'm doing that is because I wanted to give enough room for any kind of adjustment. So what I'm going to do is lay this out. I'm going to press it, and then I will mark where these will meet, and then I can trim and sew the seam together to get a nice finish on that. The 4 corners of the border are now sewn on, and they went on pretty well. So now I need to work on the applique parts. I have the designs of the chess pieces. I just found them from a coloring page and enlarged them to be the right size. Drew the designs on fusible paper so that I could fuse that onto fabric, which then I could fuse onto the border. I don't have a very big ironing space, so what I've done with each section is fold them in half to find the center of the corner of the border, and so that's what this is marking. And then 3 of the chess pieces are on one side of that and 3 are on the other. And the space for each of them is 3.5 squares. So not counting this one, 1, 2, 3.5. So that gives me the guideline on each section. I'll put the other 3 on the other side, and that lets me know where they need to be pressed down. Because of the way I want to quilt the design on this quilt, I need to actually base this quilt in my living room. So I've pushed back the furniture as much as I could and laid out the backing. Now the backing is a gray flannel, which I think will be really comfortable on the back of the quilt. Around the edges of this gray flannel, I've pinned it down into the carpet so that it will stay nice and taut. I don't need it pulled really tight, but I need to keep it taut. The batting that I'm laying out now, I am just laying it on top and smoothing it out as much as possible so that I can have a nice even layer on there. Once I have that batting down and smoothed out as much as possible, I brought out the quilt top. Now with the quilt top,
I thought it was going to be too big for the living room, but as I started laying out the quilt, I did realize that if I just made a little bit more room, then I could fully lay out this quilt and not have to do it in sections. I then made sure that my top was smoothed out along the entire top of the batting and backing, and went around the outer edges and pinned them into the carpet just like I did with my backing. Once I have that all pinned down so that it is smooth and taut, then I go through and start basting the quilt. Basting this quilt using curved safety pins so I can get through all 3 layers a little bit easier. I also use a toothpick to help lift up the edge of the pins because I'm going to be on my knees for quite some time trying to put all of these pins into the quilt. Well, it was a process, but I got the quilt completely basted. It has been a long time since I've done pin basting on the floor and my body is hurting. It took me about 2.5 hours to get that fully laid out and set up and basted. My youngest daughter did come and help me for a little bit because we were running up on the end of our time before my son would come home, and he hasn't seen this. I don't want him to see it yet. We've just got pins everywhere in the quilt so that it won't shift when I try to do the quilting. The reason I am basting the quilt here is because I need to do it on my regular sewing machine instead of on my frame. The reason I'm not doing it on my frame is with the way I want to quilt it would really make it awkward to set it up on the frame and having to basically shift it quite a bit as I'm going. Let me see if I can get to the center part here and show you. Okay. Here we go. There's a lot of quilt here. But the idea is, and this is how the creator of the inspiration quilt did it. The idea is to quilt a diagonal line going through the white. So I would have the white thread and just quilting through the diagonal around, following the pattern so that it will create that swirl going each way. I don't think I would be quilting into the black doing the same thing. So that'll be fine. I just set it up with the white and quilt the white. And then on the borders, what I'll do is in the black, I'll get black thread and just do a simple meander behind all of the background, but outlining each of the chess pieces. I'm not going to quilt onto the chess piece themselves. And then on the white borders, I will do the same with the white thread. I did run into a bit of a problem when I was basting the quilt in that the borders don't really lay completely flat. Some of that is just sewing errors on my part in trying to lay this out, working with curved seams and trying to match them up to other pieces. It's a little bit difficult, but I think what I'm going to do is just in those sections where it kind of starts to wrinkle up, I'm just going to quilt over that. On that corner, it's not too bad, but when I go, I think it was on, well, no, it's on the opposite side of the quilt, and I'm not going to find that because I am buried under quilt and batting. So I'm going to trim off this excess batting because there's a ton of it. I didn't trim beforehand when I basted it. And then I'm going to set up my machine to do free motion quilting, and get my quilting gloves and all of that set up. It is almost, yeah, it's already 11:30 tonight, so I probably won't do much quilting, but if I can get everything set up, then I hope to be able to have it all quilted in one day. I have Quilt Guild on Thursday, the next day, and I'd love to be able to take a finished quilt to show and share, or whatever they call it, basically show and tell. So that is my goal. I'm going to go ahead and get things set up, and we'll see how it goes. Well, the quilt is finished. It actually came together a lot better than I thought it would. Toward the end there, I was kind of running against a time crunch, so I didn't get as much footage. It actually looked really good. The very center, boy, that was hard because all those pieces were coming in, and I had a hole probably about that big. Not too bad, but I put a circle right over the center so that we could close up that hole. And the center part was the only part that wanted to create kind of a little bit of a ripple. It's not bad, but in the very center, I quilted around that to keep it kind of level and flat. The only other issue that I had with getting the whole thing pieced together was in the outer border. And that one, I was just kind of piecing and sewing the best I could. I didn't really have the math going properly, partly because I didn't have individual wedges, so I couldn't follow the method that the author of the blog had suggested. So I made it work. There is one section of the quilt where I basically just had to, on the outer edge, quilt in a few wrinkles. There was really no way to get around it other than ripping things apart and resewing. And frankly, I was just running out of time to be able to get that precise on some things. And I actually didn't notice the ripples in it until I basted it, until I laid it out to baste it, and then they became apparent. By that point, I just didn't have the time to try to fine-tune the top. For that basting, I had 2.5 hours, almost 3, of time to get it basted before my son came home. And so I got that done, and then was able to quilt it, and the quilting went really well. I was flying through that. I set up my machine. It was close to midnight, and then kind of got involved. So about 12:45, I finally quit, went to bed. The next day, basically, I quilted from 8 in the morning till about 12:30. Needed to take a break because my machine was starting to react to the black thread. It kept splitting, and then no, it wasn't splitting. It kept creating some eyelashes on the bottom. So I'm not sure what was going on. The black seems to come off of the spool differently than my white thread was coming off. As I was quilting, the thread would come down and kind of it would twist up on itself, then it would untwist and feed through my needle. So I'm not sure if that's typical. I'll have to kind of watch other threads. I use Gutermann. I've never really had a problem with them, but I was noticing that on this black, and I'm not sure what the issue was that. Also, my machine was getting hot with all of the quilting I was doing, so it needed a break anyway. I had to change the bobbin at one point and got it out, and it was quite warm in my hand. So it can get pretty hot. I was going pretty fast and pretty constant. So, and then binding went really well, and I'm really happy with how it looked. Chess Vortex ended up finishing at 84 by 84. I really enjoyed making this quilt, and I hope you enjoyed following along in the process of this quilt from start to finish. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them below or send me an email at soitseemscreations@outlook.com. I'm Veronica Johnson with Sew It Seems, and remember, keep stitching.